The heavy iron door slams behind you. The sound echoes down a cold stone corridor that smells of decay and unwashed bodies. It's September 1887, and you've just been admitted to the Blackwell's Island Insane Asylum for Women. The nurses grip your arms too tightly. Their fingers dig into your flesh as they drag you forward. You try to meet their eyes, searching for a trace of humanity, but they look through you as if you're already gone. Around you, women scream. Some pound on locked doors. Others sit silent in corners, rocking back and forth, their minds shattered by what this place has done to them. You know the truth, they don't. You're not insane. You're a reporter. Your name is Nellie Bly, and you voluntarily entered hell itself to expose the nightmare hidden from the world. But as that door locks behind you, as you hear the key turn in the rusted lock, a terrible question rises in your throat. What if they never let you out? What if no one believes you? What if you become just another forgotten woman screaming into the void? Her real name was Elizabeth Cochran. She was 23 years old when she walked through those asylum gates, and she was already changing the world. Born in Pennsylvania in 1864, Nellie Bly grew up in an era when women were expected to be seen and not heard. But Nellie had never been good at silence. When a local newspaper published an article claiming women belonged only in the home, she wrote a furious response, so compelling, so fierce, that the editor hired her on the spot. She chose the pen name Nellie Bly, borrowed from a popular song, and began writing about the lives of working women, divorce, and factory conditions. She wrote about things polite society preferred to ignore. But Pittsburgh wasn't enough. In 1887, she moved to New York City with almost nothing in her pockets and a burning determination to make her mark. The editors at the New York World, one of the city's largest newspapers, dismissed her at first. Women reporters were novelties, assigned to write about fashion and society parties. Nellie wanted to write about injustice. She wanted to expose corruption. She wanted to truth, no matter how ugly. Then she proposed something that seemed impossible. She would fake insanity. She would get herself committed to the women's lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island, a place wrapped in dark rumors and whispered horror stories. She would live among the patients, experience their treatment firsthand, and then write about what the city had been hiding from itself. The risks were staggering. What if the doctors saw through her act? What if the newspaper abandoned her once she was inside? What if she couldn't prove her sanity once committed? In the 19th century, women could be institutionalized for almost anything. Disagreeing with your husband, reading too many books, showing too much emotion or too little. The diagnosis of hysteria was a weapon used to silence inconvenient women. And once you were labeled insane, your voice disappeared. You became a non-person. Your testimony meant nothing. You could scream your sanity from the rooftops, and it would only prove you were mad. But Nellie Bly understood something crucial. The women trapped in that asylum had no voice. Someone had to speak for them. Someone had to bear witness, even if it meant risking everything. So she began her performance. She checked into a temporary women's home and started acting strangely. She stayed awake all night, her eyes wide and staring. She spoke in confused fragments. She claimed not to remember her own name. The other women grew frightened of her. They called the police, and just as Nellie had planned, the authorities came. The courtroom hearing was a farce. Doctors examined her for mere minutes. They asked her a few questions. She gave vague, disconnected answers, careful not to overact. Insanity, she understood, wasn't wild theatrical madness. It was quieter than that, more unsettling. The doctors conferred briefly and declared her hopelessly insane. The judge signed the commitment papers without hesitation. No family was contacted, no second opinion was sought. Within hours, she was on a boat crossing the East River toward Blackwell's Island. The asylum rose from the water like a prison. Its walls were thick stone, its windows barred. As Nellie stepped off the boat with the other new patients, she felt the weight of those walls closing around her. This was a place designed to contain, not to heal. A place to hide away the women society found too difficult, too damaged, too inconvenient. Inside, the performance ended. Nellie acted completely sane, thinking surely the doctors would realize their mistake. She spoke clearly, she answered rationally, she explained calmly that she was perfectly well. But the doctors only smiled and made notes in their charts. Her sanity, they said, was proof of her cunning madness. Her protests were symptoms. The more she insisted she didn't belong, the more insane they declared her to be. She was trapped. The daily routine was designed to break the human spirit. The patients were woken before dawn, in rooms so cold their breath formed clouds in the air. There was no heat, even as autumn temperatures dropped. The women shivered in thin, ragged dresses that barely covered their bodies. Many had no shoes. Their feet were blue with cold. Breakfast was a bowl of barely warm broth with stale bread, so hard it hurt to chew. The broth had a strange, sour taste. Sometimes Nellie found insects floating in it. The women ate anyway, because it was all they would receive for hours. Lunch was more of the same. Dinner brought thin gruel and occasionally a small piece of spoiled meat. The patients were always hungry, always cold, always exhausted. But the physical deprivation was only the beginning. The nurses ruled through fear and violence. They screamed at patients for the smallest infractions, speaking without permission, moving too slowly, looking at them wrong. Punishment came swiftly and brutally. Women were beaten with leather straps. They were locked in isolation rooms so small you couldn't lie down or stand up fully, forced to crouch in darkness for hours or days. The isolation rooms had no windows, no light, just four walls pressing in until you forgot what the sun looked like. The bath time was particularly horrifying. The nurses would grab patients, often the ones who resisted or complained, and drag them to a bathroom where buckets of ice-cold water waited. They would strip the women naked and throw bucket after bucket of freezing water over them while they screamed. Sometimes they held the women's heads underwater until they stopped struggling. They called it hydrotherapy. They called it treatment. It was torture. Nellie watched a nurse grab a woman who had dared to ask for a blanket. The woman was dragged away, sobbing, begging. Later she returned, shaking uncontrollably, her skin blue, her eyes hollow. She didn't ask for anything again. The patients sat on hard benches for hours each day, forbidden to speak or move. Guards walked between them, watching for any sign of disobedience. If you slumped, you were struck. If you whispered to another patient, you were punished. You sat in silence, staring at the wall, feeling your mind begin to fray from the sheer monotony and hopelessness. At night, the asylum transformed into something worse. The lights went out early, plunging the wards into near-total darkness. That's when the screaming started. Women crying out in terror or pain or madness. Some screamed for their children. Some screamed for help that would never come. Others just screamed, the sound torn from their throats by unbearable anguish. The nurses never came. The screaming would continue for hours until the women's voices gave out. Nellie lay on her thin, filthy mattress listening to those screams and felt her own sanity being tested in ways she'd never imagined. This was the sound of absolute abandonment, the sound of women society had decided to forget. The other patients began to trust her. In whispered conversations, when the nurses weren't watching, they told her their stories. She learned that many of them weren't insane at all. They were inconvenient. They had disagreed with their husbands or fathers. They had inherited money that male relatives wanted to control. They had been poor, homeless, or immigrant women with no one to advocate for them. They had been sad after losing a child, and that grief had been diagnosed as madness. Once inside, there was no way out. The doctors never listened, families rarely visited, letters were confiscated. If you protested your sanity too loudly, the punishments intensified until you learned to stay quiet. Many women gave up. They stopped fighting. They let the asylum swallow them whole. And eventually, they became exactly what the doctors had labeled them. The asylum didn't treat insanity, it created it. Among the screaming and the suffering, individual stories emerged. Faces in the crowd became people. There was a German immigrant woman who spoke limited English. She had been committed because the doctors couldn't understand her, and her confusion had been mistaken for insanity. She wept constantly, trying to explain herself in broken sentences, but no one would listen. She had children at home. She didn't know who was caring for them. The nurses mocked her accent and struck her when she cried too loudly. There was a widow who had been committed by her late husband's brother after she inherited the family estate. She was completely sane, articulate, and desperate. She had tried writing to lawyers and judges, but her letters never left the asylum. She told Nellie that she'd been there for 3 years, 3 years of cold baths and starvation and sitting in silence, 3 years of watching her mind slowly crack under the pressure of this place. There was a young woman, barely 20, who had been committed after the death of her baby. Her grief had been profound, overwhelming, and entirely normal. But her husband hadn't known how to cope with her tears. A doctor suggested rest and treatment. She'd been at Blackwell's for 8 months. She told Nellie she rarely thought about her dead child anymore. She didn't think about anything. It was easier that way. And then Nellie learned something that shocked her, even in this place of horrors. One patient, a woman in her late 20s with clear eyes and a steady voice, told her story in the darkness of their shared room. She had been committed because she refused to marry the man her father had chosen for her. That was all. She had said no to a marriage proposal, and her father had declared her mad. A compliant doctor had signed the papers, her suitor had moved on to another bride, and she had been locked away for 2 years because she dared to choose her own future. She wasn't the only one. As Nellie listened more carefully, she discovered other women whose crimes were equally absurd. One had been too outspoken at a church social. Another had wanted to study medicine instead of finding a husband. Another had simply laughed too loudly, too often, in a way that embarrassed her family. These weren't symptoms of mental illness. They were symptoms of being a woman in a world that demanded absolute compliance. The asylum wasn't just a place for the mentally ill. It was a dumping ground for any woman who stepped outside the narrow boundaries society had drawn for her. And once you were inside, your reasons for being there didn't matter anymore. Sane or insane, compliant or defiant, it made no difference. The asylum consumed you just the same. Nellie documented everything. She memorized names and stories. She observed the patterns of abuse. She noted which nurses were the cruelest, which doctors never actually examined patients, how the good food brought in for inspections was replaced with spoiled slop the moment the inspectors left. She saw the systemic corruption, the deliberate cruelty, the complete absence of medical care. And she saw something else. She saw women's incredible resilience. Despite everything, despite the cold and hunger and brutality, some of the patients still found ways to care for each other. They shared their meager food. They comforted each other during the worst moments. They held hands in the darkness when the screaming started. They remained human in a place designed to strip away their humanity. These women deserved better. They deserved to be heard, and Nellie was going to make sure they were. 10 days after entering the asylum, Nellie Bly was released. The newspaper had sent a lawyer to secure her freedom, just as planned. But as she walked out of those gates, breathing free air again, she felt the weight of what she was leaving behind. The women she'd met were still inside, still suffering, still screaming into the void. She had a responsibility now. She had witnessed something the world needed to see. Nellie went back to the offices of the New York World and began to write. The words poured out of her in a torrent of controlled fury. She wrote about the cold and the hunger. She wrote about the ice baths and the beatings. She wrote about the sane women trapped alongside the sick, about the complete absence of medical care, about the nurses who treated patients like animals. She wrote about the screaming. But most importantly, she wrote about the women themselves. She gave them names. She told their stories. She made them real to a public that had been content to look away.
The articles were published in October 1887 under the title 10 Days in a Madhouse. They were a sensation. New York City was horrified. Readers couldn't believe such conditions existed in their modern, civilized city. The newspaper sold out immediately. Copies were passed from hand to hand. People gathered in the streets to discuss what they had read. Nellie Bly became famous overnight. More importantly, the city was forced to respond. A grand jury launched an investigation into Blackwell's island. They toured the asylum. They interviewed patients. They found that every single thing Nellie had written was true, and in some cases, she had actually understated the horror. The jury was appalled. The investigation led to immediate reforms. The city increased funding for the Department of Public Charities and Corrections by nearly $1 million. New rules were established for patient treatment. Abusive staff members were dismissed. Conditions at Blackwell's began to improve, slowly and imperfectly, but measurably. Nellie's work sparked a broader conversation about mental health treatment across America. Other journalists began investigating asylums in their own cities. They found similar patterns of abuse and neglect. Reformers used Nellie's articles as evidence for the need for systemic change. Women everywhere saw in Nellie Bly a champion. She had entered a place where women's voices didn't matter and made those voices heard. She had risked her own freedom and sanity to expose an injustice that society had content to look away. She had proven that a woman with courage and determination could change the world.
Nellie Bly didn't stop with the asylum. She went on to have an extraordinary career. She traveled around the world in 72 days, beating the fictional record of Jules Verne's Phileas Fogg. She reported from the front lines of World War I. She became one of the most famous journalists of her era. But for many, she would always be remembered as the woman who went inside the madhouse and came back with the truth. The women she left behind at Blackwell's Island had varying fates. Some were released after the investigation, their sanity finally acknowledged. Others remained institutionalized, their cases too complex or their families too indifferent to secure their freedom. The asylum continued operating for decades, though conditions gradually improved. Understanding Nellie's story requires understanding the world she lived in. In 1887, women couldn't vote in most of America. They had limited property rights. They couldn't serve on juries. Their testimony in court carried less weight than a man's. A husband could commit his wife to an asylum with minimal oversight. A father could do the same to a daughter. The asylum was the ultimate tool of that control. It was where difficult women disappeared, where angry women, sad women, disobedient women, or simply unlucky women vanished from public view. And because they were labeled insane, no one had to listen to them anymore. Their suffering became invisible. Nellie Bly made it visible. She bore witness. She refused to look away. And in doing so, she gave voice to the voiceless. Her legacy extends far beyond those 10 days. She pioneered undercover investigative journalism, a technique that would expose countless injustices over the following century. She proved that journalism could be a tool for social change. She demonstrated that sometimes the only way to understand suffering is to experience it yourself. But perhaps her most important legacy is simpler. She believed women when they said they were suffering. She listened to their stories. She trusted their accounts of abuse. In an era when women's words were routinely dismissed, when their pain was minimized or ignored, Nellie Bly said, "I believe you. Your experiences matter. The world needs to hear this." That message still resonates today. We still live in a world where women's pain is often undertreated or dismissed, where women's testimony about their own experiences is questioned, where institutional systems can fail the most vulnerable. The specifics have changed, but the underlying pattern persists. Power silences those without it. Institutions protect themselves rather than those they're meant to serve.
Nellie Bly died in 1922 at the age of 57. She's buried in New York, the city she changed forever. The women of Blackwell's Island are mostly forgotten now. History didn't record all their names. We don't know what happened to the German immigrant, or the grieving mother, or the widow fighting for her inheritance, or the woman who refused to marry. But their stories mattered. Their suffering mattered. And because one young woman had the courage to enter that nightmare and emerge with the truth, their voices weren't completely silenced. That's the power of bearing witness. That's the importance of telling difficult stories. That's why Nellie Bly's courage, more than a century later, still matters. Because the truth always matters, even when it's ugly, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's about pain that society would rather ignore. Especially then.